From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors these broadcasts. Our guest for this program is an old friend, Marc Morano. In 1992, when I ran for President of the United States on the ticket of what was then called the U.S. Taxpayers Party, Marc was extremely helpful to me in winning a primary of something called the Independent Voters Party in Massachusetts. He's had a distinguished career. He's worked for Rush Limbaugh. He's worked for Paul Weyrich. He's worked for who else?
Brent Bozell.
Brent Bozell. And now
Inhofe.
The best member of the U.S. Senate, Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma, a truly great man. What do you do for Senator Inhofe?
I'm the communication director for his Environment Public Works Committee, and chiefly one of the battles we've been fighting is the battle against global warming alarmism against Al Gore, but we also deal with all the other gamut of environmental issues, from endangered species on down.
Talk to me about Jim Inhofe. I have the highest regard for this man. I think he's a very great man. Tell me about him and some of the issues and activities and projects in which he's involved.
James Inhofe is a marvelous man to work for. It is an absolute sheer joy to work for a United States Senator who stands for such principle, has such character, and is one of the strongest members, in terms of standing up to the mainstream media, standing up to other senators, and standing up to just pop culture today. James Inhofe was the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee. He's now the ranking member, Senator Barbara Boxer. Can you imagine? They said it was the biggest opposites in the history of the Senate, going from Senator James Inhofe as chairman to Senator Barbara Boxer of California. He is now the ranking member of that. James Inhofe, he's also on the Armed Services Committee, and he's actually poised, if McCain wins the presidency, could possibly take over the Armed Services Committee. But Senator Inhofe is also a committed Christian, and he travels extensively throughout Africa, and he's also been to Iraq many times, and he's just, again, just one of the best guys you could ever work for.
He's a very, very great man. I first met him when he was mayor of Tulsa, I believe, years ago.
Back in the 70s.
And although I don't have a lot of money to contribute to campaigns, every now and then I contribute to his campaign. He's up for re-election this year. How tough is his battle going to be?
This is a tough year for all Republicans, so no one's taking anything for granted. He's campaigning hard, and he's running against a candidate that's not that well established. So he's campaigning hard, and it's a tough year. Oklahoma
is blessed with the two best members of the U.S. Senate. His colleague is Tom Coburn. And I am not a Barack Obama fan, but I get a kick out of it when people say that Barack Obama's never done anything in the Senate. One of the best things ever done in the Senate was the Obama-Coburn bill, which put on the public record information about federal grants and contracts, something which I tried to do when I was director of OEO, and I couldn't get any help from Warren Hatch or any of the people in a position to do it who had things to do with the Freedom of Information Act, but Coburn and Obama did it, ironically. Well, what is the state of play on the global warming fight in the U.S. Senate?
Well, this is in many ways like a Greek tragedy in some ways. We just went through, in the June of 2008, the big great battle over the Lieberman-Warner global warming cap and trade bill.
Cap and trade is a term widely used in the media. And I think I know what it means, but maybe
Sure.
Our viewers don't. What is cap and trade?
Well, cap and trade is essentially a clever ploy to get around a straight carbon tax, which is what, to his credit, some congressional members have tried to actually pass, because it's an honest thing to say we're going to tax carbon. So instead of doing that, because they know there's no popular support for that in the public to have a big giant carbon tax, they've come up with this elaborate, complicated, bureaucratic cap and trade scheme, which they declare as free market, which is the height of silliness. But essentially, companies, if you're a high-emitting company of too many CO2 emissions, you would then buy credits from a company like a wind or solar company that didn't have that much emissions. And essentially, you'd put it all in the recent bill. It would have all gone to the federal government. And we're talking trillions of dollars.
What do you cap?
You're capping CO2 emissions. In other words, it's like an offset in a way. if you're emitting too much, you got to buy these credits from someone else, and then those credits go to the federal government, and they may invest in wind and solar.
You're capping your stuff, and you're trading with other companies.
Trading with other companies that are below that cap. It was the height of bureaucratic management. This was a bill that would have, the estimates were in the trillions of dollars. Even Joe Lieberman admitted the costs were through the roof. The Washington Post said it would have required a fundamental restructuring of our economy, all to do absolutely nothing to the climate. And that was the most amazing thing. As Dick Lindzen, the MIT scientist, said, he who controls carbon controls life. And this was a bill that was going to radically restructure the American economy to do nothing for the economy. It was pure symbolism on the climate.
Now, recently at the G8 meeting, President Bush made promises in the area of global warming. What was the nature of those promises, and what is the likelihood that they will ever be fulfilled?
Well, I mean, the likelihood during Bush's term, unlikely. He's, of course, on his way out. However, Bush needs to be given credit for one thing. He has rhetorically, essentially given in on some of the science and expressed concern. However, he has stood steadfast, not only domestically against any kind of global warming legislation, but also internationally against actually any UN treaties, and they've had these negotiations. So he's actually stood strong in terms of demanding developing countries be involved in any of these treaties, which of course essentially means there's not going to be a treaty because China, India aren't going to voluntarily not develop.
We would be crazy to tie both of our hands behind our back while China is the biggest polluter in the world.
Yeah, it's even worse than that. If we did tie our hands, once industry that emits carbon here, once there's restrictions and the price of doing business here goes up, a lot of these could relocate, and you're going to end up having China. They'll relocate to China, India, developing world, where they don't have the regulations we do. There could actually be a net increase of emissions from these kind of regulations. So you asked me what the likelihood of something like that happening. The next president is key. And President Obama, President McCain, we don't know where they're going to go with that in terms of any kind of treaty. We do know that Kyoto Protocol, the countries that ratified it, most of them are not meeting the requirements. And we also know that the recent G8 summit, all it is essentially countries agreeing to agree to targets down the road. It's international bureaucratic speak in many cases.
I don't think there's anyone on the Washington scene who knows more about this issue than Marc Morano, you. How did you become involved in this issue?
Well, it actually goes back. You mentioned I worked for Rush Limbaugh, of all people. I actually grew up in the 1970s, and I remember watching in the 1980s, watching National Geographic specials of endangered species and all these environmental alarmism. When the environmental alarmism was getting picked up, and I remember really feeling when they'd see a tree cut down. I remember being upset when they showed monkeys, looked like the monkeys were crying. And then it wasn't until years later, by the mid-'80s, I started looking into it a little more, and one of the big influences was Patrick Moore, former founder of Greenpeace, who later turned against the group because he said they were actually anti-environmental and anti-human. I actually started looking into it and found that not only, and I did an Amazon rainforest documentary, I did a series of specials on endangered species, on wetlands, on Keiko the killer whale. I did one on organic food, organic farm practices, which then all led me to global warming eventually.
You did this for Rush Limbaugh?
I actually did it for Paul Weyrich as American investigator, and I did a lot of it for Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, as is seen, I covered all the environmental events in Washington for Rush Limbaugh as well.
Do you stay in touch with Rush?
Actually, yeah, I in touch with his staff. I just saw him last year at the Media Research Dinner, hosted by Brent Bozell, and got a chance to talk to him. Rush has, is very nice when you see him, because I had a lot of fun doing that show. Our big claim to fame. I was his man in Washington, the Washington, D.C. correspondent. Had my camera taken at the Clinton White House in 1993. Now, the only media that were really outraged were Helen Thomas, Brit Hume, and Andrea Mitchell on NBC. The other media didn't seem to make a big deal, but we made the nightly news, and it got some outrage. And in fact, Helen Thomas, the dean of the White House press corps, marched me personally into the White House press office so they could apologize and return my camera. This was something they had criticized Richard Nixon.
That's the nicest thing I've ever heard about Helen
Thomas.
Yeah,
it is. Well, I can't say anything bad because of that incident. And they used to call Richard Nixon King Richard, and they talked about his enemies list. But here, Bill Clinton, his administration seized a camera, the first time in the history of the White House, according to Helen Thomas. And the rest of the media had a big yawn, except for there's a few key exceptions there.
Well, that's great. And is there such a thing as global warming?
There's such a thing as climate change. And actually, there is global warming. But it doesn't mean it's man-made global warming, and it doesn't mean if there was man-made global warming we could do a darn thing about it, short of reverting to living in huts made of dung. But to answer your question, we've warmed slightly, maybe a degree Fahrenheit since the 1850 or so, or 1900, depending on what chart. But we only warmed up until about 1940. In fact, the hottest decade in the United States is still the 1930s. We've actually cooled since the 1930s. Then we actually went to a cooling trend into the mid-70s to the point where the National Academy of Sciences, scientists at NASA, Time, Newsweek, renowned meteorologists were all warning of a coming ice age in the 1970s. Well, then we warmed from late 1970s to the late 1990s, and now we've been flatlining ever since and actually slightly cooled in recent years. So to answer your question, we've had 2 decades of warming, the late 70s to the late 90s, that have created all this hysteria, and we've not had warming in the last decade.
Stay with us. Our guest is Marc Morano, who serves on the staff of United States Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, in my view, the best member of the U.S. Senate. And one of the reasons he's the best is because he's got Marc Morano serving him and giving him the facts that he needs to be an eloquent foe of the global warming alarmists and the environmental extremists. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I'm Congressman Tom Tancredo. You know, I just returned from a hearing on the southern border in a place called Brownsville, Texas. One of the participants in the hearing told us that for them, a border really doesn't exist between the United States and Mexico. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people have that attitude, that there are no such things as borders, that they really don't matter, that they're just lines on a map and nobody should pay attention to them, and that we're all just residents of the North American continent. Well, you know what? That's baloney. It's baloney, but only if you will do something about it to prove to the people of this country, and especially to your elected officials, that you know borders matter, that you know the sovereignty of this country is at risk, and that you will take action to make sure that they understand it. That action is best taken by calling your local talk radio stations, writing letters to the editor, and of course, letting members of Congress know that you know. That's the best thing. They're hoping, as a matter of fact, that no one really picks up on this issue of a North American trade association that essentially eliminates borders. But the fact is it's happening. You can see parts of it all of the time. So it's something that we need to stop. America, and I mean the United States of America, not the continent, but the United States of America is at stake. Do your part.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips with our guest Marc Morano on the staff of Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. Marc has a distinguished career. He worked for me. He worked for Rush Limbaugh. He worked for Brent Bozell. He worked for Paul Weyrich. And he's made himself the leading expert on the myth of global warming as characterized by Al Gore and his colleagues on the left. You know, one of the things that most disturbs me, Marc, and I know it concerns you as well, is the indoctrination of our young people on television, in the government schools, and elsewhere to think that we have an incredible environmental crisis and that there are things they must do that are outlandish. It's as if environmentalism has become a religion.
It absolutely is. In fact, one of a recent columnist actually said Al Gore's the Pope, SUV drivers are the sinners, hybrid drivers are the saints. And actually, Vanity Fair had Senator James Inhofe in one of the levels of hell. In Dante's Inferno, they had all these levels of hell there, and they had Senator Inhofe and other global warming, because people challenge the science, as you just mentioned, presented by Al Gore. They put them into this essentially like they're some kind of evil incarnate. Now, as far as children's indoctrination, Senator Inhofe has actually given full floor speeches on this. This is something, parents out there everywhere, kids are being told that essentially that the family SUV is destroying the planet. There was an article just out today basically talking about kids asking what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they say, what's the point? These are fourth graders. What's the point? We're all going to be dead then. Or the planet will be gone by then. These kids, fourth grade classes, are issuing reports declaring global warming a disaster. This is with the participation of principals, teachers, the parents involved. Kids are making documentaries in elementary school. One kid in Canada was forced to watch Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, 4 times in 4 different classes.
Well, what about the state where we're broadcasting, the Commonwealth of Virginia? Can't members of the legislature do anything about this?
It's very difficult. One of the problems...
I thought we had the separation of church and state.
Well, I'm finding even in private schools. I actually spoke at a private school in Vienna, Virginia, that actually had showed Al Gore's film, and they brought me in as balance. So this is permeating public, private. It's gotten so bad, Scholastic Books has a textbook by Al Gore's producer, Laurie David. And the book actually reversed, it had major scientific errors in it, but this is being distributed throughout all the kids. The UN has children's books that they've now promoted to the United Nations Environmental Program. So it's international.
And we're paying for all of this with our taxes.
Oh, absolutely. Our taxes, our foreign aid. In England, actually, you got to give them credit. A man named Lord Monckton, a former Margaret Thatcher advisor, actually was involved in a lawsuit the guy's name was a truck driver in England that sued the school there. And the way England's system is set up, a judge actually ruled in favor of the parents and said that whenever they show Al Gore's film, they got to list 9 major scientific errors, and they've done that now. So they've actually had a major victory. It's not that simple here because it's spread out. Although the founder of the Weather Channel, John Coleman, has actually talked about openly suing Al Gore for essentially creating this global warming hysteria.
What is to be done?
Well, the first thing people need to realize, and you'll hear, you can turn on ABC News, CNN, you can turn on any network show and any mainstream news magazine. Newsweek's perhaps one of the worst. Time Magazine's right behind them. You have to realize everything you're hearing is all computer model predictions. And here's the bottom line is people need to realize the Earth is well within natural variability. The New York Times has admitted it. If anything, we've cooled since the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are still the warmest part of our time, from about 900 to 1300, and that's before SUV, before factories. Second point is all the fear is driven by these unproven computer models, which even the UN says can't account for all the factors in nature. And the third thing is consensus is a complete political construction. In fact, the UN is behind this. There's only 52 scientists that actually sign off on these alarmist statements from the UN. But there's about 2,000 bureaucrats, delegates, and other people affiliated with it. So the media turns that into the 2,000 of the world's top scientists. This is one of the most misunderstood myths about this whole thing.
Now, what about those poor polar bears with no ice floes left on which to sit?
The polar bears, just like I was up in Greenland, actually, and they had just shot a polar bear the week before I was there.
Shot with a camera or with a gun?
No, with a gun. It had wandered into the local town. And polar bears are not warm, fuzzy, cuddly creatures. They're meat eaters, man killers, if you want to say that. Essentially, the polar bear, and this is where I think the left has to be given credit. They think, during the Cold War, many people said the Soviets were chess players. They'd think many moves ahead, and the U.S. was episodic, short-term checker players. Well, the environmental left, and probably the entire American left, is actually very similar in terms of strategy. They look at this in terms of decades. They were plotting this in the 1970s, and now they have, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has designated as a threatened species the polar bear. Now, what that means is, first of all, you can't look at that today. The polar bears are not threatened. They're plentiful. They're now 5 times more than they were from 40 years ago. Their numbers are up from 3,000 to 5,000 to now 25,000. So you ask, well, why are they endangered? Well, they're endangered because computer models, which violate the basic methodology of forecasting, according to the world's top forecasters, say in 2040 the polar bear may be endangered based on computer models. So based on that, the EPA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, EPA is a separate issue. The Fish and Wildlife Service will now, at some point, depending on how court rulings go, future administrations interpret this, will be able to regulate barbecues in your backyard, your SUV, where you put your thermostat. California's already tried to have an emergency control by the government to affect your heating and air conditioning.
Jimmy Carter tried that when he was president.
That's right. They're going to try to tell you that you can't run your lawnmower because the CO2 could go up into the atmosphere and theoretically affect the habitat of the polar bear in the Arctic. That's what we're faced with at some point here. This is such a groundwork for future government control that it is beyond capacity. Now, the other issue along the same lines is the Environmental Protection Agency Supreme Court ruling, Horde Supreme Court ruling, declared CO2, carbon dioxide, which is plant food, a pollutant. And now the EPA has the power to do all the regulations that Congress just rejected. They're going to be able to step in, future EPA administrator, and regulate carbon.
Of course, that violates Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, which says all legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. Regulators cannot constitutionally make law.
Yeah,
but they do it anyway.
They do. In Washington, if only Washington actually followed that.
Yeah.
So that's what we're faced with at this point. We defeated them in the Senate. We defeated them spectacularly. Almost nearly a third of Senate Democrats couldn't even vote for the turkey of a bill, the Lieberman-Warner bill that went down in flames. And now...
Well, at least we know Warner won't be in the Senate anymore.
Well, he's retiring this year, yes. Yeah, and it looks like we're probably going to end up, that's going to be an open seat. So it looks as though it'll probably go to the hands of the Democrats based on, I don't want to turn into a prognosticator, but
right.
But when you pull back and look at this, what we defeated legislatively, they may end up getting bureaucratically because of planning, funding, organizing, thinking decades ahead.
In addition to your boss, who are the heroes? Václav Klaus, the head of the Czech Republic.
Yeah, on this issue, yes, absolutely. Václav Klaus grew up under communism and now says the greatest threat to freedom since communism is gone is what he terms ambitious environmentalism. Now, it goes beyond global warming. This is it's a movement called sustainable development.
What does that mean?
Well, it means all things, but essentially it means developing in only ways that are considered earth-friendly. And what they consider earth-friendly is as the environmentalists define it. They don't consider tree cutting or modern society earth-friendly. I actually interviewed someone from Friends of the Earth International who said the entire 20th century was not sustainable. In other words, we'd have to go back to the 19th century horse and buggy before they're happy.
Well, if we have electromagnetic pulse problems, that could happen. Listen, we have to take a break and have some public service announcements. When we come back, we're going to let you, the viewer, find out how you can make contact with Marc Morano and get some of the hard facts with which he deals. Please stay with us. We'll be back after these messages. The very first clause in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, immediately following the preamble, asserts that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States consisting of a Senate and a House of Representatives. All legislative powers, that means you cannot give other entities the power to legislate, not the United Nations or the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund or the federal judiciary or regulatory agencies or federally funded private organizations. If you're going to stick to the Constitution, only the Congress can make policy, and the Conservative Caucus works to assure that Congress will more nearly conform to the Constitution.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org, 703-938-9626.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable, now being broadcast in more than 120 communities across America. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Conservative Roundtable, please check out our website, www.conservativeusa.org. And if you want us to send you, at no charge, information of the kinds that we discuss, fax to our fax number, 703-281-4108, your contact information, and we'll do our best to send you some useful information. Marc, how can people get more information from you and contact you?
The best way, we actually issued a report in December 2007 detailing over 400 scientists. It's grown to over 500 dissenting from the United Nations Al Gore view of climate science. They go to epw.senate.gov, epw.senate.gov, and you can read all about this. No home with school-age kids should be without the Senate report debunking the global warming nonsense.
You know, the environmentalists think of themselves as goody two-shoes, full of idealism and doing wonderful things to supposedly save the planet, but there are real victims of radical environmentalism and global warming. Who are the victims?
The victims are the 1.6 billion people without electricity or running water. And that poverty, that misery, that human suffering, the people living in, and I was in Kenya last year, people living in the huts made of dung with the fire, breathing in all the, the wood-burning fire that they have because there's no infrastructure, the high infant mortality rates, short life expectancy, no medical care, no dental care, you name it. Hollywood glamorizes that. Drew Barrymore, who makes $15 million a picture, did a show on MTV, essentially glamorizing all these countries with high poverty rates, saying how great they are and how they're unspoiled in the environment. The regulations by the modern environmental movement, be it DDT, be it development restrictions, be it stopping dams in countries like India, they call it cultural genocide, because to bring running water and electricity to the poor people of these countries, they say that will end their traditional lifestyle, their subsistence lifestyle. The people have lived this way for thousands of years. There's no reason they shouldn't continue that.
So in other words, they don't want people to live in the modern world.
Yeah, and I was down in the Amazon along the Rio Negro, and we interviewed people who knew of Sting and all his rainforest efforts, and they said Sting was only out for himself, that they wanted progress, they wanted development, and they actually spoke only in contempt for environmentalists who go down there and essentially preach. I call them green missionaries. They actually preach to these people that they're living right. They're living the right way in mud huts.
So
That's
this
the way they
has
should
replaced
live.
communism, Marxism as the new political religion. Marc,
Yes.
you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing your time with us. Keep up the good work, and same for Senator Inhofe.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Conservative Roundtable.